Ready to dive into Senegal. We're going way back to their colonial past to understand how they got to where they are today with their new president and everything.
It's a fascinating story, and you're right. The recent election is just one piece of it. We've got that YouTube video transcript, Senegalo, de la colonisation à l'élection de Bassirou Diomaye Faye. Really makes you think.
It does. And to really get into it, we got to rewind, right? Like back to when Senegal was a French colony.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it this way. How did a religion that wasn't even from Africa become so central to life in Senegal? Over 94% of people there are Muslim.
It's one of the most Muslim countries in Africa. How'd that happen?
Well, it's a gradual process, right? It starts way back, like 8th, 9th century. Arab Berber traders, they come to Senegal shores, and they bring with them more than just goods. They bring Islam.
So it wasn't like some overnight conversion. It was more subtle.
Yeah, it was integrated into their existing society over time.
Hmm.
But it wasn't always peaceful. You get to the 11th century, and you've got the Almoravids, the dynasty that founded Marrakech. They start pushing for wider conversion to Islam.
So you've got this external pressure, but something tells me it takes more than that to make a religion central to a whole culture. There had to be people within Senegal who embraced it, made it their own.
Right, you need those internal figures who resonate with people. Take El Hadji Malick Sy. He was this scholar, a spiritual guide. People revered his teachings. And then there's Amadou Bamba.
He founded the Mouride Brotherhood.
Right. That's the one. Many saw him as a miracle worker. And his Sufi order, it had a huge impact on Senegalese society, even outside of religion. So you start to see how Islam becomes deeply woven into the fabric of the country.
Okay, so by the time the Europeans really make their move in the 19th century, Islam is firmly rooted.
Right. Though, of course, the Europeans have been sniffing around for centuries by that point. The Portuguese were some of the first to arrive way back in the 15th century.
Explorers, like what were their names?
Alves Catamosto was one, Dinas Diaz another. They weren't just there to admire the scenery, though. They saw opportunities for trade.
And sadly, we know what that means, the slave trade.
Exactly. And this is where Gorée Island comes in, a place forever scarred by its role in that horrific chapter.
It's almost hard to say that name, Gorée Island, without feeling the weight of it all.
It's a stark reminder of the horrors of that era. And it's not just the Portuguese. You've got other European powers vying for control. The French, they saw their chance. By the 19th century, they were pushing out the competition.
And establishing themselves in those key areas, right?
Right, places like Saint-Louis, Gorée, and Dakar. And by 1895, they formally established French West Africa, with Dakar as the capital. So now Senegal is right at the heart of this French colonial project.
But here's what I find interesting. Senegal's experience under French rule, it wasn't all the same.
You're right. It's not as simple as saying it was all bad. For example, the French invested more in education and infrastructure in Senegal compared to some of their other colonies. They even gave French citizenship to some Senegalese.
Really? Who got citizenship?
It was mainly people living in those main urban centers, Saint-Louis, Gorée, Dakar, and Rufisque. They call them communes.
So they created a system of privilege within the system of colonialism. Did that have lasting consequences?
Definitely. It created divisions, but also opportunities. Think about Blaise Diagne. He comes from this more privileged background, gets a good education. And in 1914, he gets elected to the French National Assembly. First African deputy ever.
That's incredible. Talk about shaking things up.
Right. But this is also where things get complicated. Because for every Blaise Diagne, there's someone like Lat Dior. He was the Damel of Cayor, and he resisted French rule fiercely. Refused to bow down.
He especially clashed with them over that railway, right? The one connecting Dakar to St. Louis.
Exactly. He saw right through it. That railway, it wasn't about progress for Senegal. It was about the French consolidating their power, making it easier to move goods and troops. Lat Dior, he wasn't just talk. He was a brilliant military strategist. Led his forces to victories against the French despite being outgunned.
Wow. He must have been quite a leader to inspire that kind of courage.
He was. But tragically, like so many who dare to resist empires, he was killed in battle in 1886.
His story is both inspiring and tragic at the same time.
It really is. And it's not just him. There were so many others.
Like Mamadou Lamine Dramé.
Yes. He understood that to fight the French, he had to unite people. And he used his position as a religious leader to rally people against French policies. He showed how much faith and resistance were intertwined.
But even with all this resistance, the French, they were masters of exploiting division.
Classic divide and conquer. They'd pit different groups against each other, weaken the resistance from within. It's a tragic pattern,
And that's what ultimately allowed them to solidify their control?
in a way.
Hmm.
But even as they tightened their grip, cracks started to show. Look at the story of Sekou Cissé, for example. He was a Senegalese tirailleur. You know, those soldiers recruited to fight for France.
Okay, so tell me about him.
This man, he fought bravely for France in World War I. He got wounded multiple times, comes back home expecting to be treated like a hero, right?
Yeah.
Instead, they basically spit in his face. They refused to give him the pay he earned and wouldn't even let him go back to his family.
Are you serious? That's awful.
The worst part is, his story wasn't unique. There were countless others who were treated the same way, broken promises, betrayed trust. But Cissé's case, it became a symbol of that betrayal. See, they arrested him on these bogus charges, exiled him to New Caledonia, where he died in 1933. Still yearning for home. It sparked outrage, made people question everything about French rule, and all of this is happening as France's own power is starting to decline.
So they knew their days of empire were numbered.
Yeah, but they weren't just going to walk away. They needed a plan B.
Yeah.
What they did is actually even more insidious: neocolonialism.
So they give up direct control, but they're still pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Precisely. And they start looking for local leaders who will help them do it. Leaders like, well, I think we should probably save that part for after the break.
I think we left off talking about neocolonialism and how the French were looking for their guy, someone to kind of ease that transition, right? Someone they could work with.
Yeah, and in a way, Léopold Sédar Senghor, he was the perfect fit. Almost too perfect, some would say.
Because he loved French culture, he even wrote poetry in French.
He was practically a poster boy for French assimilation.
Yeah.
He mastered their language, won their literary prizes, even became the first African to achieve the aggregation.
The aggregation. What is that? Like some super prestigious academic thing?
It's like the highest academic rank you can get in France. Super competitive, and he nailed it. But here's the thing. While he's scaling the heights of the French intellectual world, he's also wrestling with this fundamental question. What does it mean to be an African man in a system designed to erase that identity?
That's quite the internal conflict. And it spilled over into his political life, didn't it?
Absolutely. So in 1945, right after the war, he's elected to the French Assembly.
Was he demanding immediate independence for Senegal?
Not quite. He wanted more autonomy for African colonies, sure, but he still believed in this idea of a French federation, a more equal partnership, he thought.
A lot of people probably thought that was naive, right? Thinking the French would ever treat them as true equals.
Oh, he faced a ton of criticism for it. People said he was too close to France, that he was prioritizing that relationship over true independence. And those criticisms, they never really went away, even when he became Senegal's first president.
Which he did in 1960.
Yep, and he stayed in power for 20 years.
That's a long time. What were some of the key moments of his presidency?
Well, you can't talk about Senghor without talking about the Mamadou Dia affair. It cast a long shadow over his rule.
Mamadou Dia, that was his prime minister, right?
That's right. And he was a brilliant economist, but he had very different ideas about how independent Senegal should be, meaning he was much more radical. He directly challenged French interests, even called out Senghor for being too cozy with them.
I bet Senghor didn't like that very much.
Not one bit. In 1962, Dia was arrested. They accused him of attempting a coup.
Sounds like a convenient excuse to get rid of a rival.
A lot of people thought so. They sentenced Dia to death, but later reduced it to life in prison. It really hurt Senghor's reputation.
I can imagine. What else happened during Senghor's presidency?
Well, there were the student protests in '68, which were brutally suppressed, and this constant undercurrent of him being a puppet of France that never really went away.
But surely he must have had some successes too, right?
Of course, you can't deny that Senegal was relatively stable under his rule, and the economy did grow, especially compared to other newly independent African nations. He also championed African culture, things like the Negritude movement.
Which was all about celebrating Black identity, right?
Exactly. It was a way of pushing back against centuries of colonialism, trying to erase their culture and history.
So a mixed bag then, really. Some good, some bad.
Yeah, he was a man of contradictions, and that's why his legacy is still so debated today. But in 1980, he surprised everyone and decided to step down. His prime minister, Abdou Diouf, took over.
Abdou Diouf. Now, he was a different kind of leader, wasn't he?
Totally. Less of the poet, more of a technocrat.
So what were his priorities?
Modernizing Senegal. He focused on the economy, on infrastructure. He launched some big projects like Sonatel, the national telecommunications company.
Trying to bring Senegal into the 20th century.
Exactly. And he also poured resources into tourism. He saw it as a way to attract foreign investment and boost the economy.
Did it work?
To some extent, Senegal definitely became more modern during his time. And on the world stage, he was very active. He spoke out against apartheid in South Africa, got involved in international peace missions.
Raised Senegal's profile, you could say.
Yeah, he did. But back home, problems were brewing. The economy, while improved, wasn't great. And people still saw him as too close to France.
That same old story, neocolonialism.
Yep. And then in 1994, they devalued the CFA franc.
Which was, remind me.
The currency used by many former French colonies, including Senegal. It was tied to the French franc, which meant that when the franc went down, the CFA franc went down too.
And that hurt the Senegalese economy.
Big time. People blamed Diouf, said he was too willing to let France dictate their economic policy.
So all that progress he made, kind of overshadowed by this.
In a way, yeah. And it all came to a head in the year 2000. Diouf was up for re-election, and a new challenger emerged, Abdoulaye Wade.
He'd been around for a while by then, right? Trying to become president.
Oh, yeah. He founded his own party, the PDS, back in the 70s, and he'd run for president several times, but never won until 2000.
And he campaigned on this platform of change, right?
Exactly. He promised to break with the past, to end corruption, to make Senegal a truly independent nation.
And people, they were hungry for change, so they voted for him.
Which meant Senegal had its first peaceful transfer of power since independence. A really historic moment. But, as we'll see, Wade's presidency wasn't exactly smooth sailing either.
It never is it?
Nope. Politics is messy, and power, well, it has a way of changing people.
So we've got Senghor the poet, Diouf the technocrat, Wade, who really shook things up.
And then we get to Macky Sall, trying to walk that tightrope between progress and, well, those same old accusations of corruption and favoritism. But then along comes Ousmane Sonko, and everything changes.
He's such a different kind of figure, right? Not your typical politician.
Not even close. This is a guy who started his career as a tax inspector. Can you imagine?
Not exactly the usual path to political stardom.
But that's what's so interesting, because that's where it all began for him. He saw firsthand how corrupt the system was.
And he wasn't afraid to say something.
Oh, he was fearless. He organized a tax workers union, challenged the government. They ended up firing him for it.
I bet that just made him more determined.
Exactly. It backfired on them completely. People saw him as this incorruptible force, a true man of the people.
And so, in 2014, he creates his own party, Past Stuff.
And his message, it really resonated, especially with young people. They were tired of the same old, same
Like
old.
tired of the corruption, tired of the lack of opportunities.
Exactly. And Sonko, he was different. He was young, charismatic, and he wasn't afraid to call people out.
He directly accused Macky Sall of being corrupt.
Oh, yeah. In his 2018 book, he basically threw down the gauntlet, accused Sall and his cronies of being in cahoots with foreign companies, exploiting Senegal's resources for their own gain.
Wow, that's bold. How did Sall react?
Denied everything, of course. But the damage was done. Sonko had tapped into this deep well of anger and frustration. People believed him.
So going into the 2024 election, he was a real threat.
Huge threat. And I think that's when things got really ugly.
Because that's when the accusations against him surfaced?
Yeah, the rape charge. It was like they were trying to discredit him. Sonko insisted it was all fabricated, a way to knock him out of the race.
And was it ever proven?
No. But again, the damage was done. The accusation alone was enough to create doubt. Then in 2023, they convicted him on this vague charge of corrupting youth.
Corrupting youth? What does that even mean?
Exactly. Even legal experts were scratching their heads. They sentenced him to 2 years in prison. Everyone knew it was politically motivated.
So, of course, people took to the streets.
It was chaos. Some of the worst unrest Senegal had ever seen.
So did Sall back down?
He did, but not in the way you might think.
Yeah.
He announced he wouldn't run for a third term.
Really? So maybe the protests worked?
Maybe. Or maybe he just saw the writing on the wall. Either way, he stepped aside.
Yeah.
But then he turned around and basically handpicked his successor, Amadou Ba.
It's like they weren't even trying to hide it anymore.
Right. But here's the amazing part. Even from prison, Sonko still managed to galvanize his supporters. He endorsed a member of his party, Diomaye Faye, to run in his place.
Faye. I have to admit, I didn't even know who that was before all this happened.
Most people didn't. He was a nobody. But he carried the torch for Sonko, for change, for a break from the old ways, and guess what? He won.
Wow. The people had spoken.
They sure did. It was a historic victory for Sonko's movement, even if he was behind bars.
So where does Senegal go from here? What happens now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Faye, he's got his work cut out for him. The economy is a mess. There's still so much unrest. And then there's the question of Sonko.
Will they release him? Will he be able to play a role in this new government?
Who knows? Senegal's at a crossroads. They've been through so much. But one thing's for sure. This story is far from over.
That's the thing about history, right? It's always unfolding. We just get to watch it happen. And sometimes it's messy and complicated, and there are no easy answers. But thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been quite a ride.